Welcome. We are going to talk about why structure is important. How various commentators have structured this book and how I see the book structurally, with some comments in each section to give you an idea of what's coming when we discuss these sections more in depth. First, why is structure important? Structure is the most important element in any writing. For the Book of Ruth, structure is how the author wants to communicate his main point of the book, and how the major characters, such as Ruth, Naomi, Boaz, help to progress the author's main point and the author's themes that he wants to communicate to his audience. As was displayed earlier, the main character is Naomi, and from her downtrodden state to restoring her from losing everything, such as her husband, her children, and to restoring her to have grandchildren, is a major plot in this book. But not only physical restoration, but spiritual as well is another major theme of this book, where she goes from God is against her in chapter 2, verse 21, to God is for her, chapter 4, verse 13 to 17. Not only restoration, but contrast is a major tool used to communicate the author's purpose. Sometimes it's a contrast of attitudes and actions, or in just one character, such as Naomi. Her name meaning pleasant, and her being bitter in chapter 1, verse 20. Full and empty, chapter 1, verse 22. And the living and the dead, verses chapter 2, verse 20. Sometimes the contrast by characters such as Ruth and Boaz. Ruth is young, foreigner, poor, widow, while Boaz is middle-aged, affluent, and Israelite, and respected in his community. Ruth and Boaz aren't the only characters that seemingly are opposites. Both Orpah and Ruth are opposites as well. One stays and the other leaves. Another opposite in the book of Ruth is Boaz and the other redeemer. One is pictured as having one of integrity and the other one is not. Opposites provide the reader to see the characters such as Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz as a multi-dimensional characters and help to progress the author's main point. These tools of explanation are secondary in nature to the author's main tool to tell a story, and that is the structure, which will provide the means for the author to communicate both his major and minor themes of the book. Without a properly balanced structure, these events are merely a collection of disconnected ideas that do not have any coherent purpose. The structure allows the author to put the ideas and themes for a singular purpose. Now we will explore the book of Ruth and its structure. Many commentators, most scholars, see the book of Ruth in 4 different acts, with a prologue and an epilogue, while sometimes scholars include the prologue and the epilogue in their acts, like Frederick Bush in the Word Biblical Commentary, as can be seen here, where that he has an act, and in the act that he has the prologue and the problem, chapter 1, verse 1 to 22. Act 2, Ruth meets Boaz, Naomi's relative on the harvest field, chapter 2, verse 1, verse 23. Act 3, Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz on the threshing floor, chapter 3, verse 1 to 18. And finally, in Act 4, the resolution and the epilogue, chapter 4, verse 1 through 22. But other times, scholars have the prologue and the epilogue as distinct elements, almost sandwiching the acts, as Lawson Younger does in the NIV application commentary seen here, where you have the prologue of misery and emptiness, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. It's telling us the setting and the predicament to Naomi. In Act 1, Naomi's return, verses 7 to 22. Act 2, where you have Ruth and Boaz in the field, chapter 2, verse 1 through 23. And then we are introduced to the character of Boaz. Ruth in the Act 3, in chapter 3, meets Boaz on the threshing floor. And then finally in Act 4, Boaz arranges to marry Ruth, chapter 4, verse 1 through 12. And he takes on the role of kinship. And finally in the epilogue, chapter 4, verse 13 to 17. And finally, that there is a son born to both Ruth and Boaz. And Naomi is restored to life and fullness. And here that you also see an extra part of the genealogy in verses 18 to 22. Here Lawson sees that the genealogy as a distinct element, but at the same time acknowledges the tension of what some other scholars see the Act 4 as part of the epilogue. Both Bush and Younger have a more condensed form of structure, while others like Block include not only the acts, but also each scene of each act. As can be seen here, that you have Act 1, that the crisis for the royal line. Then in Scene 1, that we see the setting for the crisis. Scene 2, the nature of the crisis. And in Scene 3, that the response to the crisis. Scene 4, the interpretation of the crisis. Then in Act 2, that you see this ray of hope for the royal line. Chapter 1, verse 22 to 23. We see Scene 1, and it sets up with a new setting. Scene 2, the initiative of Ruth. Scene 3, the grace and kindness of Boaz. And finally in Scene 4, that the results of that. In Act 4, that you see the complication for the royal line, verses 1 to 18. In Scene 1, that you see the scheme that is portrayed. In Scene 2, the implementation of the scheme. And in Scene 3, the results of the scheme. And finally, in Act 4, the rescue of the royal line. In Scene 1, the legal resolution in verses 1 through 12. In Scene 2, that you see the genealogical resolution, verses 13 to 17. And lastly, in the epilogue, the genealogy of the royal line, verses 18 to 22. Sometimes authors don't list them as acts, but as acts and scenes, but list 4 main divisions, as does in the JPS commentary on Ruth, as is seen here. Chapter 1 is the departure and the return, the journey from loss to redemption. Chapter 2, finding favor and food in the field when Boaz meets Ruth. Chapter 3, the transformation, the transformative midnight encounter between Ruth and Boaz. Chapter 4, the redemption and the restoration that happens to both Ruth and Naomi. Although there are some differences in how the various scholars and commentators structure, one thing is for certain. It is undeniable. All of them see 4 major divisions within the book. With that I can now explain how I have structured the Book of Ruth. I see the structure as 4 main parts or acts, and with Acts 1 and 2 paralleling each other, and also Acts 1 and 4 parallel, and Acts 2 and 3 paralleling one another, as seen below. First, we see the prologue, 1 through 5, and it lists the background and it introduces the major problem of the book. Then in chapter 1, verse 5, it's the journey back home, and some major things are developing. Why is she going back home? And it starts to introduce levirate marriage. Culturally, what's going on? Ruth has this depth that is. Orpah leaves. Then in Act 1, it's going home. Scene 1 is the journey back home in verses 5 through 18. But the big question, why is she going back home? Like, how does she know that that's going to happen? And these are the things that start to really form together, that you see this orbed out view of Ruth. And then in Scene 2, that you see the arrival in Bethlehem, There's confusion on the people. Naomi starts to get more depth. She feels God is against her because of her tragedy. The classic verse in verse 20 and 21, she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Then we see this first sign of providence in verse 22. It says, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite with her, who returned from Moab, we returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest." Then in Act 2, that you see that the Redeemer is introduced. God provides for Ruth and Naomi. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 17. Scene 1 is where Ruth encounters Boaz. And Boaz is seen as a man of integrity in verse 4, where the text says, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.'" Then in scene 2, Ruth is invited to work and eat and guaranteed safety. Chapter 2, verse 8 to 17. Providence is seen all throughout this chapter, fellowship and adoption as well. And Boaz has been watching Ruth from afar. Chapter 2, verse 10 to 13, when it said, "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of her husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to the people you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.' Then she says, 'I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants.'" Then in scene 3, that we start to see Ruth learns about Boaz's connection to Naomi in verses 18 to 23. Then in Acts 3, Ruth proposes to Boaz. In scene 1, Naomi encourages Ruth to pursue Boaz. In scene 2, Ruth pursues Boaz for marriage in chapter 3, verse 6 to 13. And you also see providence in this section. No one sees her here. And there's a contrast between Boaz and Noah and the drinking of night, where Boaz acts as one of integrity and Noah did not. In scene 3, you see the journey back home in verses 14 to 18. And here's another point of providence. No one sees her. Then in the final act, Act 14, Boaz marries Ruth and Naomi is restored. Scene 1, Boaz's proposal to the other Redeemer. There's this contrast of character between Boaz and the other Redeemer. He meets him in front of the gate. Yes, this is where business was done, but it also shows that the lack of integrity of the other one and forces him to be accountable. Scene 2, Boaz buys Naomi's land and Boaz promises to marry Ruth. This is in one sense a promissory note of what he promises to do for her. We see here that there is a disconnection between the events and the customs of the book and the people who are either may be reading Ruth. In verse 7, it says this: "Now this was a custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal, gave it to the other, and this was the manner attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, 'Buy it for yourself,' he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all of the people, 'You are witnesses this day that I have brought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon.'" In verse 10, "Also Ruth the Moabite, The widow of Mahlon I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. There's this unique blessing on Ruth in verse 11. We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Finally, in scene 3, Boaz marries Ruth. Naomi is restored in chapter 4, verse 13 and 17. The blessing of Naomi in 14 and 15 when it says, then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Finally, we see in the epilogue that the genealogy in chapter 4, verse 18 to 22. In conclusion, although I have 3 scenes in every act, with the exception of chapter 1, one could condense act 4 in just 2 scenes, and you would have a perfectly balanced story that is parallel to each other. Chapters 1 and 4, chapters 2 and 3. Where chapter 1 is when the problem is introduced, and in chapter 4, when it is resolved. Chapter 2 and 3 is the development of God solving the problem that was introduced in chapter 1. This aligns very much with how Block sees the development, as you can see right here. Structures are vital keys in understanding the author's purpose. And the main idea, we see the author of Ruth weave a problem and solution type story, with chapters 1 and 2 are almost opposites. Chapter 1 is where the problem is introduced, and chapter 2, or chapter 4 is where it is resolved, and Naomi is restored. Chapter 3 and 4 mirror the number of scenes, which points to that the majority of the development in the book, it is in chapters 2 and 3. We have described why the book was written, who are the major characters, and when it was written. We can now dive into the individual parts of the book of Ruth, starting with the prologue in chapters 1, verses 1 to 5. Until you see me next time, have a wonderful, wonderful day.